my second ngVikings. ngVikings is very, very special to me. Last year we were in Copenhagen, and today we're in the very warm and sunny Helsinki. So my name is Simona Cotin, as my dear Theyre mentioned, and I work as a cloud developer at Microsoft. And my role is to make JavaScript and the web a first-class citizen in the cloud. So if you have any questions about JavaScript or about Azure or about Angular, I'm a huge Angular fan. Please go ahead and ask Asim. That's a game that we do. He's going to be there and answer all the questions. This is our logo. We absolutely love it. And this talk is actually a very selfish talk. Because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a developer advocate. And although many people might think that we're out there partying and having a lot of fun, and some other people might think that we are just running through everyone, like burning through their money, we actually spend a lot of time on a plane, or in a train, or in a hotel. And some of the issues with that, or one of the most important issues with that, is that the internet connectivity 99% of the time in those places is absolutely awful. So that just made me think that I want every website out there to be a progressive web app. Do you agree? Yeah, and many times before a conference like this, like you're tweaking your last slide, or you're tweaking your last demo, last-minute demo, and then you're like, oh my God, this is not working, this is terrible. So then, that's what triggered me to look into PWAs. And today we're going to look into a quick intro into PWAs, progressive web apps, a dive into main concepts, how we can build Angular applications, or how can we leverage Angular applications to build progressive web apps. And we're also looking into tools and success stories. So what is a progressive web app? Well, the progressive web apps are web applications that are regular web pages or websites, but it can appear to the user like traditional applications or native applications. How many of you have built native applications? They're great, right? They're super cool, but they're not web. They're not web. Another definition that I love about progressive web apps is that they're just websites that took all the right vitamins. And this comes from Alex Russell. And Alex Russell is a Google Chrome developer. And he's actually the person, well, together with his wife, they coined the progressive web app term. And they did that while they were out for dinner and they were discussing the state of the modern web, like who doesn't do that? And they also came up with a list of things that make up a progressive web app. And the first thing that's important with progressive web apps is that our users' experience should enhance as they're using our app, or as they're based on their device and based on their browser's capabilities, the experience should get better. Also, we should make sure that our application is responsive, so it fits any form, like mobile or tablet or desktop or laptop or whatever. Very important, I cannot stress this enough. It should be connectivity independent, which means that your app should do something even when it's offline, just like native apps do. It should also feel natural to the user. So we should make sure that the navigation is very similar to what we have in native apps. We should make sure that our content is fresh, just like a vegetable. Like once the application is back online, we should make sure that we are updating the content, right? We've been offline for a while. We're still looking at some of the cached files, but once we're online, we want to make sure that we're delivering the latest content. Because service workers are super important and they have so much control, we should make sure that they cannot be tampered with, so our application is safe. It should be discoverable, which means that people should be able to Google our app. So we don't want to search for apps in the App Store because searching in the App Store is kind of not very helpful. So we want to use our friend Google or Bing or whatever. We also want to make sure that people can receive push notifications when they want to. So the application is re-engageable. And we want to make sure that once our users have used our application a few times, they can actually install it. I've been using this app for a while. I'm actually loving it. I want to be able to access it from my home screen. I don't want to go to the browser anymore and open that app or search for it. And like one of the properties that we love about the web is that we can share links with our friends. And we want to make sure that our apps are also linkable. So if we were to put this in a word cloud, this is how it would look like. But these are all a lot of buzzwords and a lot of words that might or might not make sense. They're definitely important. But how do we actually take this and put it into code? So there's this thing called the baseline appiness, and this is from Alex Russell as well. And it just refers to how can we make, what makes up a basic PWA. And the first thing that the core thing to PWAs are service workers, web manifests, and everything has to be served over HTTPS. So we have to be secure. Service worker, web manifest, delivered over HTTPS. And if we were to look at a definition of what are service workers, they're basically proxies that sit between the web page and the network, and they provide cached versions of the site when no network connectivity is available. And a very nice analogy that comes from Dean Allen Hume, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He has a book called Progressive Apps. I recommend you go read it if you're interested in the subject. So he's suggesting that we think of web requests as planes taking off. And then you have an air traffic controller, and they're sitting, those are just like our service workers, and they route requests. So it can load from and then it can load from the network or even off the cache. And like we have our web page, right? And then on the same side as our web page, we do have our service worker. And then over the network, which is the dotted line, we have our backend. And on the same side as the web page, we have our cache. So this would be a diagram of where service workers are and like how we can visualize it. And if we were to think of this in terms of a request response kind of scenario, well, we have our user which requests something from a web page, and then our service worker is intercepting that request. It has the power to do that, and then it thinks about it. It's like, yeah, I've received the request, and then it works really hard, and finally, it decides to retrieve the data from the network. And then our backend returns the data, and then we return a response to our user. But then the other scenario is where we do all the thinking, and instead of retrieving the data from the backend over the wire, we retrieve it from the cache. And we can imagine the advantages of this, right? Because instead of just making requests that take a very long time, we are just retrieving data from our browser. So that's going to be very fast, and that's going to allow us to give data to our user even in an offline scenario. So the first thing that we need to do with the service worker is register it. And we can do that by just calling the register method on the navigator service worker object. But before we do that, we need to make sure that the service worker is available in the browser. And we do that by like having this check. I'm going to show off this cool clicker that we have. And a service worker has a scope and a life cycle. And I bet that scope sounds very familiar, especially in the Angular community. But in the case of a service worker, a scope defines which requests can a service worker intercept. And the default one, when we're registering our application, when we're registering our service worker, just like the second parameter, invisible parameter to this method, is the current folder. So a service worker by default will have access to all the requests to the current domain, and then everything that's like a subdomain to that. So if we were to make a request to xyz.sw work, then we would have, if we were to register the service worker to that domain, then we would have access to that in the subdomain. Another important thing about service workers is that they run in a completely different context. So you have the web worker or the service worker context, and this is your web pages context. And the service worker is not allowed to interact and cannot interact with anything on your web page. So you cannot use the service worker to change any of the DOM elements in your application. And that's something that's important to remember. In terms of the lifecycle, we start with no service worker. And then once the user enters a URL, we go ahead and download the service worker, we parse it, we execute it. And that gets us into the installing phase where we can we can move from there, if everything goes fine, into the error phase where, like, for example, if we're trying to cache some items and those have downloading them from the server has failed, that goes into an error phase. Otherwise, we're in the activated state, and that means that we can listen to events like fetch, or we can even, like, if we go into an idle state, we can decide to save some memory and terminate, and once there's some notifications coming, then we can come back to life. So some of the events that I've talked about, the first one is we're listening for the install event, and we can do things like cache a cat.svg object. Who here likes cats? We are all dog people. Martin, who's not here, he just said that Azure Cognitive Services thinks that dog is negative and cat is positive, which is weird, right? Okay, cool. So we have access to this object called caches, and this is where we store our cache, and we can retrieve an object from static.v1, and then we can add our image there. And then we can listen to the activate event and maybe log something, make sure that like we're logging that everything was okay. And then we are listening to the fetch event, and that's here. And once we receive a request for dog.svg, we make sure to replace that with cats. If you're wondering about the service worker support, it's currently fully supported in Firefox and Chrome. And it's also fully supported in Chrome for Android and Samsung Internet. And it's in development for Safari and Edge. And a few days ago, there was this announcement on the 25th that service workers are going to be released with the Safari 11.1 version for both iOS and Mac OS. So that's great news. We're looking forward to the Edge release for that. But it just means that we're almost there, right? In terms of, because service workers are such a fundamental building block to PWAs, we want to make sure that everyone's on board with this. So if we go back to the keywords that we looked at earlier, with service workers, we managed to achieve connectivity independent, fresh, and discoverable. And then the next thing that we need to look into is the manifest file. And the web manifest provides information about an application in a JSON text file. And the purpose of the manifest is to install web applications to the home screen of a device, providing users with quicker access and a richer experience. So basically, the web manifest allows us to ask the user whether they want to install the app to their home screen or not. And that's something that our browser decides. So at the moment, we cannot programmatically control when to show that notification. The browser will show it based on a heuristic that it runs in the background and decide whether our user is like, yeah, they like our application and they've used it enough times so that they can have it on their home screen. And this is how web manifest file can look like. It's a simple JSON object where we define things like the name of our application, some of the icons that are going to be used to display the app on the home screen. We can also define a theme color, which will be the navbar color, and also whether we want to display it standalone, for example, if we don't want to show the URL or not. And that's quite simple, right? And we've added to our list of like items installable. And then the final thing that we need to take care of is making sure that we serve the service workers over HTTPS. Because remember, we're basically controlling what the user is seeing with service worker, which means that if our service workers are tampered, like we have the man-in-the-middle attack, our service workers are taking over, they're going to be able to, the attacker is going to be able to return whatever content they want to. And that's not okay. So we need to have HTTPS. And we've added save to our list. But then how do we take this to Angular? Well, we can create everything manually. So we can create service workers and add the web manifest file manually. But actually, the Angular CLI helps us with a lot of that. So we can create a new app and just add the -- service worker flag. And this will add a service worker to our app. And the first thing that this is going to do is basically go to our Angular CLI.json file. And from there, it's going to set this flag, service worker, to true. And this will tell the Angular CLI that it needs to build our service worker. The other thing that happens is in our app module file, we're going to import the service worker. But also, we're going to make sure that we are registering our service worker. And we do that by calling the register method in the service worker module. And there's one thing here that's not completed. And this is a condition where we're testing whether we're building the app for production or is just development mode. And because service workers are caching things for us, we actually don't want to run service workers in development mode because we want to have the latest sources when we're developing, right? So this means that if we want to test our service workers, we first need to build for production. The other thing that's being created for us is this ngSW -config.json file, which is a JSON that describes our service worker. And in here, you'll see that we have the assets group. And we basically have some rules for caching our files. So we're saying that our index file is index.html, and then we're defining how we're caching our assets. And we can define things like how do we cache when we're installing the service worker, and how do we cache when we're updating. And in the first part, we are prefetching the files that are actually on our critical path. Ideally, when you're installing the service worker, you want to make sure that you are caching the files that make up your app shell. And app shell is a term it's a way to build progressive web apps. If you remember, when we're opening a native web applications, normally we do have, by default, we have our navigation, and maybe we have a title or something, and then once we're online, we are populating dynamically some data. So that represents the thing that we see before our data is being populated is called our app shell, and we want to make sure that we are prefetching that during the service worker install phase. And then we can define either where we want to install things lazily as well. And other things that we can cache as well are our data. So when we're making calls to our API, we can cache some of that data as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and build for production using the Angular CLI. I guess that this looks familiar to almost everyone here. And this will generate the dist file where we actually have generated the NGSW worker and the JSON file, we have it there. And the first thing that I did was, oh, I'm super excited, I've created my first PWA. Let's go ahead and use Lighthouse to test whether my app is progressive. And Lighthouse allows you to test for things like progressive, performance, best practices, and accessibility. So what do you think? Is my app going to be super progressive? Yeah? 100%? Asim says 100%. Meh. So this is not very good news. Our app is 55%. You're almost there, Asim. Almost there. And then our performance is not great, but our accessibility is awesome. That's just because it's a very bare-bone application. But still, what did we miss here? Why isn't our application progressive? Sorry? Perfect. Cool. Yeah, so the first thing that I did was, after I've been very upset, I started looking at the failed audit. So as you can see, Lighthouse actually gives you all the information to make sure that you can fix your application. Oh, that was the... So the first error message there is that we do not provide a fallback content when JavaScript is not available. So with progressive web app, it's very important that we always show our user some information. So instead of showing them a blank page, we should definitely show them some information about what's happening. So one thing that we can do is just add the NoScript tag, where we're just adding this message like, this website requires JavaScript. And you have to do, like, you have to enable it. Who doesn't use JavaScript? The other thing that was a problem was the fact that we're not serving our content over HTTPS. And this was very fast as well. Like, I know how to fix this. I'm going to deploy my app to Azure, and then I'm going to enable HTTPS only by just clicking a button. And that was very fast. Obviously, while you're developing this, you shouldn't necessarily worry about your HTTPS in localhost, but then when you're pushing this to the world, you have to make sure that you have HTTPS enabled. The other problem, as very well guessed, we didn't have our manifest file defined. So you can either go ahead and define it yourself, or you can go to this tool, which is called PWA Builder, which will help you generate a new manifest.json file. One other thing that you can do here is maybe go to angular.io and paste in the link there, and it will actually give you their manifest.json file. I really like how angular.io is built as the documentation page, so that's one thing that we can do, and then we can download this. So we're up to 91% progressive. The last thing that we need to do is add the meta tag with the theme color that will color our sidebar, our URL bar, or yeah. And now we're 100% progressive. Yay! That's exactly how I felt. So what if you're going to say, like, what if I have an existing app, Simona? All this talk for nothing. Well, it's actually not true because we have to follow exactly the same steps. We need to add the service worker package, and then we need to enable service worker support in the CLI. Remember, just added the Angular CLI file, and then we need to import and register our service worker in our module. And then we need to create our service worker config file, and again, we can create it by hand or just copy the one that's generated by the Angular CLI, and we're good to go, right? These are the first steps. Then obviously, we need to make sure that we are continuously checking whether our app has the right score here. So you've already seen me use some of the tools available. One of the most important ones is the Lighthouse. And this comes both as a Chrome developer plugin, or you can also use it as a CLI. But the cool part is that you can also integrate it in your CI/CD pipeline, which means that you can continuously test whether your application is still performing well as a progressive web app. Another cool tool is the PWA Builder. It allows you to generate a manifest file, create a service worker, and also publish your PWA. Workbox is recommended. It's like a more generic tool for building PWAs, and it helps with caching and analytics. That's very cool if you're using maybe React or Vue, but in Angular's case, I do recommend using the Angular CLI for this. Pinterest is another company that has invested a lot in service workers, and one of their coolest packages is this working? Is this one, Service Worker Mock. It allows us to test service workers, which is great because that's one of the pain points for service workers. It's hard to test them, but they create this separate environment that allows us to write tests for service workers. And then the Hacker News PWA collection of applications is also great. It's a collection of Hacker News apps built to be progressive with the best practices in mind and across different frameworks. So you can go ahead and have a look here, and you're going to see things like time to load and what's the score on Lighthouse and how you can improve your application. Angular CLI, we've already seen how powerful it is. Some success stories. Well, as I mentioned, Pinterest has invested a lot in making their application progressive, and they've looked at their mobile usage, and they realized that I think maybe 90% in their international customers were using their web app on mobile, and they decided to spend more time on improving their users' experience, so they achieved things like people spending 40% more time in their app, and that's huge. Adios Money has written a very good article about this. I recommend you go read it. And then another use case is the Flipcard application, which is an app for, that's the biggest e-commerce Indian app or website or business. And they've made their app progressive, and they managed to increase their conversion with 70% when the users were opening the app from the home screen. That's one of the statistics. But I do recommend you go read this article as well. So the thing that I want to leave you with is that progressive web apps are just a new way to deliver amazing user experiences on the web. So if you want to build reliable applications and performant, do make sure to look into progressive web apps. Thank you.